He didn't even have the decency to warn her. 200 people in black tie, champagne in every hand, cameras waiting for the moment everyone assumed was coming, and Dane Voss walked onto that stage, holding another woman's hand like Mara Ellison had never existed. 4 years. She gave him 4 years of her life. She rebuilt his reputation when the tabloids were burying him. She stayed up until 3 in the morning, rewriting financial models that saved his first development from complete collapse. She sat across from investors who didn't believe in him, and made them believe, not because she had to, but because she thought they were building something together. And in 30 seconds, in front of everyone who had ever watched her stand beside him, Dane announced his engagement to Sloane Mercer. He didn't look at Mara once. Not once. If you've ever been in a room full of people and felt completely alone, if you've ever given everything to someone who was quietly planning their exit, stay with me. Because what Mara does next is something nobody in that ballroom expected. And if you're new here, subscribe now and hit the bell so you don't miss a single moment of this story. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Like this video if you believe that the best revenge is a life they never saw coming. Because Dane Voss thought he was done with Mara Ellison. He had no idea he'd just handed her the match. The night started the way most disasters do perfectly. The Meridian Crown occupied the top floors of a glass tower above Chicago's lakefront, the kind of place where the chandeliers cost more than most people's homes, and the staff was trained to make every guest feel like the most important person in the building. Mara had been here before many times, always beside Dane, always aware of the way his hand found the small of her back when photographers appeared, always grateful for that small gesture that she had mistaken for tenderness. Tonight she had arrived alone, which she told herself was intentional. She wanted a few minutes to herself before the crowd swallowed her. She stood at the edge of the ballroom in the ivory gown she'd bought 3 weeks ago, not too formal, not trying too hard, the kind of dress that would photograph well beside a proposal. And she watched the room fill with the people who had spent the last 4 years deciding whether she was worth knowing. Most of them had decided yes, but only after she proved it. She recognized almost everyone. The Calhoun brothers, who ran a private equity firm that had nearly walked away from Dane's second project, until Mara flew to New York and spent 6 hours in a conference room changing their minds. Senator Weyrich, who'd attended Dane's charity gala 3 years in a row and had stopped ignoring Mara approximately 18 months ago when he realized she was the one who actually understood policy implications for urban development. 3 board members of Voss Meridian Holdings, who had initially dismissed her as a girlfriend playing businesswoman, and now sent meeting requests directly to her calendar. She had earned every one of these people, and she had done it while standing slightly behind Dane, which was what he preferred. Her glass was half empty when she saw him across the room. Dane Voss at 35 was the kind of man who understood exactly how he looked to other people. He was tall enough, confident enough, handsome in the way that photographs well, and only slightly disappoints in person. He wore a custom tuxedo that Mara had helped him select 3 weeks ago at a fitting she'd attended, because he trusted her judgment more than his own on anything that required actual taste. His hair was perfectly arranged. His expression was the one she privately called, his public smile present but unreachable, designed to suggest warmth without offering any. He was surrounded by people who were laughing at something he'd just said. He did not look for her. She waited. He never looked. Mara told herself this was nothing. He was working the room. That was what they did at events like this. They separated. They worked different corners. They reunited at dinner and compared notes over wine. It was a system they'd developed together, partly practical and partly because Mara had learned early that standing at Dane's elbow for an entire evening made investors talk to him instead of her, and she had things to accomplish beyond being decorative. But something felt different tonight, a pressure at the back of her skull she couldn't name. She noticed the way a few people near her seemed to be watching her instead of the room. Brief glances, quickly redirected. The way a conversation 2 feet away dropped in volume when she turned. Small things, the kind of signals that your body registers before your brain catches up. Then she saw the woman. She was standing with Dane. That alone meant nothing. Dane stood with many women at these events, and Mara was not the kind of person who tracked her partner's movements across a ballroom, but this woman was different. She wasn't standing beside Dane the way a business contact would. She was standing close, her shoulder touching his, her posture comfortable, in a way that only happens between people who have spent significant private time together. Mara set her champagne down carefully. The woman was beautiful in an expensive, deliberate way. Dark hair, flawless skin, a gown that cost more than most people earned in a month. Early 30s, composed, the kind of calm that comes from never having had to worry about money or access or being taken seriously. She was laughing at something Dane said, and when she laughed, she touched his arm, not a flirtatious touch, something more proprietary, and Dane smiled down at her in a way Mara recognized. That was his private smile, the one he didn't perform. She was still trying to decide what she was looking at when one of the Calhoun brothers materialized beside her. Holding a fresh glass of champagne he appeared to be offering. "He looks good tonight," he said. Mara took the glass automatically. He always does. A pause. "You okay, Mara?" She looked at him. His expression was careful. The kind of careful that means someone knows something and has decided they're not going to be the one to tell you. "Why wouldn't I be?" she said. He didn't answer. She looked back toward Dane. The woman was still there. The program began at 8:15. The hotel's events coordinator made a brief, elegant speech about the evening's charitable component, proceeds benefiting urban housing initiatives, which had been Mara's suggestion a year ago when she'd argued that Voss Meridian needed to connect its public image to something that felt genuine rather than performative. Dane had resisted initially. She'd won the argument with 3 pages of data on philanthropic perception among their target investor demographic. She had written the talking points that the events coordinator was now delivering. The string quartet shifted to something softer as Conrad Voss was introduced. Mara had always been slightly wary of Conrad. Dane's father occupied a different register than anyone else she'd encountered in 4 years of moving through this world. He was 58, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had once been striking and was now simply authoritative. He spoke rarely at events like this, and when he did, people tended to stop moving. He gave a brief, controlled speech about Voss Meridian's next phase of growth. He thanked the investors. He thanked the board. He made a single oblique reference to the importance of choosing your partners carefully, and something in the way he said it, the particular weight behind the word choosing, made Mara's chest tighten without understanding why. Conrad left the stage to measured applause, and then Dane walked up. He was supposed to make a brief toast. That was what they'd discussed, a short acknowledgement of the evening. Something warm but professional, the kind of speech that kept the party moving without making demands on the audience's attention. Mara watched him take the microphone. She watched him adjust it, with the particular ease of someone who has decided they're comfortable with what comes next. And then she saw the woman in the dark gown appear at the edge of the stage. She watched Dane reach out his hand. She watched the woman take it. And she watched Dane smile, his private smile, the real one, the one she had believed for 4 years was only ever directed at her, and draw that woman up beside him in front of 200 people. The room changed, not loudly. There was no gasp, no obvious shift. Just a slight collective adjustment, the way a crowd rearranges its attention when something unexpected happens, and the new configuration of that attention suddenly excluded Mara entirely. She heard her own heartbeat. Dane said, "I want to take a moment tonight to make 2 announcements." His voice was smooth, practiced. He had rehearsed this. The first is one I think many of you have anticipated. Tonight, I'm proud to announce the formal strategic partnership between Voss Meridian Holdings and Mercer Capital. Applause. The name registered Mercer Capital, the name she'd seen in his files 3 months ago, the meetings she'd asked about and been told were preliminary, nothing confirmed, nothing significant yet. And the second announcement, he turned to the woman, is personal. Mara stopped breathing. Most of you know Sloane Mercer. But tonight I want to introduce her in a different capacity. He reached into his jacket pocket. The box was small, dark, the kind of size that means only one thing. "Sloane, in front of everyone here, people who matter to both of us, I'm asking you to marry me." The room erupted. Genuine, uncomplicated applause, the sound of 200 people who understood the business calculus of this moment and approved of it, who saw 2 powerful family names aligning and interpreted that as good news for everyone present. Mara didn't move. She was standing in the center of the ballroom, in a dress she'd bought 3 weeks ago, surrounded by people she'd spent 4 years cultivating on Dane's behalf, and she was watching the man she'd planned a future with place a ring on another woman's finger in front of all of them. She heard her own name in the ambient noise around her. Not spoken to her, spoken about her. The word rippling quietly through nearby conversations, attached to sideways glances, to careful expressions, to the specific discomfort of witnesses who are grateful not to be the person at the center of a public humiliation. She understood then what the past few minutes had actually been. The Calhoun brother, with his careful expression and his offered champagne. The dropped voices, the glances. Some of these people had known. Maybe all of them. She set her glass on the nearest surface without looking for it and walked toward the corridor behind the ballroom. The marble hallway behind the grand ballroom smelled like cold air and fresh flowers. The noise from inside, reduced to a muffled celebration, the sound of 200 people toasting a future that had just been built from the debris of hers. Mara stood still for a moment, both hands at her sides, and did something she almost never allowed herself. She felt it fully. The humiliation. The grief underneath the humiliation. The specific acid anger of someone who has just realized that what they were building was never mutual. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps. She had expected anyone but Dane. But there he was, stepping into the corridor alone, his expression carrying something she didn't immediately recognize. Not guilt. Something more complicated, relief maybe, the particular ease of someone who has finally done the thing they've been dreading and discovered it was survivable. Mara. She turned to look at him. She waited. He clasped his hands in front of him, the new ring on Sloan's finger, presumably still gleaming in the ballroom behind him, and he said, "I know this wasn't how you expected tonight to go." "Wasn't how I expected it," she repeated. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "I should have told you sooner." "I know that." She studied him. 4 years. She had 4 years of data on this man, his tells, his rationalizations, the specific way his jaw tightened when he was about to say something he'd already rehearsed. She knew him well enough to recognize that this conversation had been prepared, that he'd anticipated her reaction, and constructed a framework for managing it. "Then why didn't you?" she said. He rolled his shoulders slightly. "Because I knew you'd try to argue me out of it, and you thought I might succeed." Something moved across his face. Mara. His tone shifted, the practiced sympathy flattening into something more businesslike. "We've been building in the same direction for 4 years. That's real. What you contributed, what we built together, that's real. But the company is at a different stage now. The Mercer partnership opens doors I can't access any other way." She stared at him. "So this is strategic. Sloan and I have genuine." "Stop." Her voice came out quiet, too quiet, the way it always did when she was furious rather than hurt. "Don't sell me something I watched. You sell a room full of investors 2 minutes ago." He stopped. She watched him recalibrate. "You're better than this," she said. "You're better than standing in a hallway trying to frame your engagement as a business decision while I'm supposed to, what, understand? Thank you for your transparency? I'm not asking you to—" "What did you think would happen, Dane?" Her voice remained level, which seemed to unsettle him more than volume would have. "Did you think I'd applaud from the crowd? Help her pick the flowers?" He exhaled, and then he said the thing. The sentence she would remember for years, not because it was cruel in an obvious way, but because of what it revealed. He said, "You helped me get here, Mara. But Sloan can take me where I'm going next." He delivered it with the tone of someone offering a reasonable explanation. She heard it land somewhere deep, not in her ego, not in her pride, but in the place where she had kept the version of herself that believed she had mattered to him. She didn't say anything for a long moment. She reached up and unclasped the diamond necklace at her throat. The one he'd given her on their 2nd anniversary, in a restaurant in New York, in a moment she had categorized under love rather than investment. She held it out. He looked at it, then at her. She placed it in his palm. "You're going to remember this night differently someday," she said. Dane's mouth curved, a small condescending smile, the smile of a man who thinks a woman threatens consequences of performing for her own benefit. "I'll be fine, Mara. I know you will," she said. "So will I." She walked back through the corridor, through the ballroom without stopping, through the lobby, past the staff at the entrance, who held the door, and out into the cold Chicago night where rain had started without warning, thin and relentless against the sidewalk. She didn't run. She just walked and kept walking, and let the rain hit her hair and the silk across her shoulders, and did not look back at the lit tower behind her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that someone had watched everything from a private balcony above the ballroom. Conrad Voss had not returned to the event floor after his speech. He rarely did. He showed up at these evenings for the quarter hour that was required of him, and then retreated to somewhere quieter, which tonight had been the balcony his suite connected to, where he could see the ballroom below through soundproof glass without being in it. He had watched Dane take the stage. He had watched him produce the ring. He had read the room the surprise that wasn't entirely surprise, the manufactured celebration of something that had clearly been coordinated in advance, the particular quality of the applause that meant people were approving a deal rather than honoring a love. And then he had looked for Mara. He'd found her by the stillness. Everyone else in the room had moved, adjusted, leaned, turned toward the stage. Mara hadn't. She had stood in the center of that crowd like something solid, her face doing something he recognized, because it was the same thing he had trained himself to do, over 30 years of making hard decisions in front of people who were watching for weakness. She was processing without showing it. He watched her leave. He watched Dane follow her toward the corridor, then reappear alone 6 minutes later, already reaching for someone's offered drink, already smiling. Conrad stood at the balcony for a while after that. He had built Voss Meridian from a single property in a bad neighborhood in Chicago's South Side at 26. With a loan his family had collectively scraped together and a business plan he'd rewritten 11 times. He had made mistakes, many of them. He had walked into rooms where people dismissed him and come out with their contracts. He had failed publicly twice and recovered both times through discipline rather than luck. He recognized competence. He had been watching Mara Ellison for 2 years. He had read everything she'd written. Every restructuring analysis, every investor memo, every proposal she'd shepherded through boards that should have been beyond her access, given her title, which was technically nothing. She had no official role at Voss Meridian. She was Dane's girlfriend. She acted as an unofficial strategist with no credit line anywhere that acknowledged what she was actually doing. Conrad had noticed. He had said nothing, partly because the dynamic between Mara and his son was not his business, and partly because he had assumed, as he now recognized, was a mistake that his son would eventually understand what he had standing beside him. He watched the lobby cameras relay footage of Mara crossing the marble floor below. She walked like someone who had already decided what came next. He removed his glasses. He thought about Dane's smile when he'd returned to the ballroom. The ease of it. The complete and apparent absence of awareness that he had just made an irreversible error, not a moral one. Conrad was beyond judging his son's romantic choices, but a structural one. He had discussed the smartest person in the room. And Conrad, who had not survived 30 years of building things by ignoring structural errors, felt something settle in his chest. Something that wasn't affection, exactly, but something adjacent to it. He was going to remember this night, and so was Mara Ellison. She didn't sleep until nearly 3 a.m. Not from crying, she wasn't crying, which surprised her slightly. The way the body sometimes refuses to perform the emotion, the mind insists is appropriate. She sat in the kitchen of her apartment in Lincoln Park, still wearing the ivory gown because she hadn't gotten around to taking it off, a cup of tea going cold in front of her, and she ran calculations. The way she always did when she needed to think. She had approximately $72,000 in her personal savings account. She had consulting experience that was technically undocumented, because she had done most of it informally under Dane's name through Voss Meridian's infrastructure. She had relationships with a meaningful number of executives and investors who respected her, not because of Dane. She was reasonably confident of this, but because of work she had done directly, in rooms they shared, conversations they remembered. She had a reputation. It was just attached to someone else's name. She looked at the cold tea. She looked at the chair across from her, which was empty. She thought about Dane's face in the corridor, the specific quality of his expression when he'd said she helped him get here. Not apologetic, not guilty. The tone of someone making a reasonable argument about resource allocation. She had been a resource. She understood this now with the particular clarity that arrives at 2 a.m. when pretense becomes too exhausting to maintain. She had been useful, skilled and useful and genuinely necessary. And Dane had known it. That was the part that deserved attention. He hadn't dismissed her competence. He had relied on it extensively for 4 years. He had simply categorized it in a way that was entirely separate from whatever it meant to be chosen. She stood up. She walked to the window. Chicago moved below her, indifferent and sleepless, the lake invisible beyond the city lights. She thought about what she actually had, not what she'd lost. What she had: contacts, experience, a way of seeing financial structures that she had tested against real problems under genuine pressure. An understanding of the real estate market in this city that most people with official titles didn't possess. She thought about the word scaffolding. Dane hadn't said it, but it was what he'd meant. Something useful until the building could stand without it. Some things you dismantle when the structure is complete. The problem with that metaphor, she thought, was that scaffolding gets reused. She went to bed. She slept 4 hours. In the morning, she started writing a business plan. The next 3 weeks were the hardest she could remember since the year she was 24, fresh out of her MBA, working 2 consulting jobs simultaneously while trying to build enough of a track record to be taken seriously. Grief moved through her on a schedule she couldn't predict. Sometimes it arrived at inconvenient moments in a coffee shop, reading an email that mentioned a Voss Meridian project she'd helped design, realizing for the first time that her work would be credited elsewhere. Sometimes it didn't arrive at all for entire days, and then hit at 10 o'clock at night with the force of a physical illness, the specific body knowledge of what it meant to have organized your future around the wrong person. She let herself feel it when it came, and then she put it down and went back to work. She called in every relationship she'd built over 4 years. Not dramatically, not with any announcement of what had happened or why. She called former colleagues, investors she'd helped, executives who'd told her to reach out if she ever needed anything. She had a very good memory for exactly who had said that and what circumstances had produced the offer. She was honest. She'd left her previous situation. She was starting her own firm. She was looking for early clients who needed serious restructuring expertise, not the surface-level consulting that most boutique firms delivered. Several people said they'd think about it. 3 said yes immediately. One of them was a mid-sized real estate developer who'd been trying to restructure debt on a commercial property for 8 months and wasn't finding acceptable solutions through the larger firms he'd engaged. He'd worked with Mara twice through Voss Meridian, and he remembered what she'd done. He signed an engagement letter before she had a formal office address. She found the office on the Chicago River 2 weeks later. A modest space, the kind of space where the furniture was presentable but not impressive, where the windows faced the right direction. She hired 2 analysts from her network, young, sharp, underpaid at their current firms, the kind of people who wanted to learn rather than simply be employed. She named the firm Ellison Advisory. She didn't tell anyone who Ellison was because she understood that her former last name would generate the wrong question. She wanted people asking about her work, not about Dane. The first morning she sat at her desk with her name on the door, she allowed herself 60 seconds to feel it not triumph. Nothing that grand, but something smaller and more durable. The specific satisfaction of a thing built correctly. Then her phone rang and she answered it. There was too much to do for anything else. What she didn't track, because she had made a deliberate decision not to, was Dane's response to her absence. She heard things, inevitably. Chicago's real estate world was not so large that silence was possible. She heard that Sloan Mercer had moved into Dane's penthouse. She heard that the Mercer-Voss partnership was generating the headlines Dane had wanted. She heard his name attached to deals that were presented as his and were, as far as she could tell from a distance, built on the infrastructure she had helped create before leaving. She didn't think about this too much. The first time she heard his name and felt nothing was approximately 6 weeks after the ballroom. She noted it, moved on. What she was less able to ignore what arrived in the form of calls from former Voss Meridian contacts who had reason to mention it was that a significant redevelopment project Dane had been pushing was encountering serious problems. A mixed-use development in the Fulton Market District, a project Mara had reviewed at an early stage and flagged concern about, specifically the assumption structure in the financial projections. She had written a memo. Dane had reviewed it and told her she was being risk-averse. He had been wrong. The numbers were collapsing the way she'd said they would collapse. The gap between projected and actual costs was widening. Lenders were nervous. Board members were asking questions that didn't have good answers. She heard this and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What she felt was closer to exhaustion on behalf of everyone who was going to have to fix it. She wasn't wrong about the relief, either, when the call came. It came on a Tuesday morning in January, 8 degrees outside, the river a flat gray through her office window. Her assistant told her a man was in the lobby asking to see her. No appointment, no assistant accompanying him. He'd given his name but asked her assistant not to relay it, which was either eccentric or strategic, and she suspected both. She told her assistant to send him up. Conrad Voss walked through her office door, carrying his own coat and Dane's disastrous financial projections in a manila folder, and he looked around her office, the way someone looks at a thing they are seeing for the first time, and calibrating against their expectation of it. Then he looked at her. "You're not what I expected," he said. "You expected something more dramatic," she said. "A revenge operation." "Something like that." She gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Sit down." He sat. She waited. "The Fulton market projection," he said, and set the folder on her desk. She looked at it without touching it. "I know what's wrong with it." "I know you do," Conrad said. "You told my son 11 months ago." A pause. "He showed you the memo," she said. "He showed me the project summary. I had to find the memo myself." She looked at him. "What do you want, Mr. Voss?" He leaned back slightly. "I want to know if you'll consult on the restructuring. For Dane's benefit, for the company's benefit." Something shifted in his expression. "My son made a poor decision. That doesn't mean 200 employees should pay for it." She held his gaze. "And if my involvement creates complications, with Dane, with everyone, then it creates complications." He didn't blink. "I'm not here to manage appearances. I'm here because the problem needs fixing, and you're the best person to fix it." She studied him for a long moment. Conrad Voss had the qualities she associated with people who had built things under real pressure, a specific kind of stillness that didn't read as calm so much as contained. He was not performing this conversation. He was conducting it. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them. Complete independence on my recommendations. No interference from Dane or his team. No expectation that my involvement implies anything about my position toward your family, your son, or your company's future." "Accepted." She looked at him. "Just like that. You said 3 conditions. They're reasonable. I accepted them." She uncapped her pen. "I'll need full access to the financials, not the version that was presented to the board. The actual numbers. You'll have them by tomorrow morning. And I want a written agreement that makes my independence explicit before I begin. My counsel will draft it tonight." She looked at him again. There was something she didn't entirely trust about how easily he was agreeing, not because she suspected bad faith, but because she was accustomed to powerful men finding reasons to qualify their commitments once the conversation turned specific. Conrad was not qualifying. Either he genuinely wanted her help without strings, or he was a more sophisticated version of the problem she'd already encountered with his son. She decided she would proceed carefully and revise her assessment as evidence arrived. "All right," she said. She reached across the desk. He shook her hand. His grip was brief and firm, the handshake of someone who considers the gesture a formality rather than a performance. After he left, she sat still for a moment. Then she pulled the folder toward her and opened it. She had 14 minutes before her next call. She read the whole folder in 11. She was already writing notes in the margins when her assistant knocked on the door. "Your 2:30 is here," her assistant said. Mara closed the folder. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. And she sat there for exactly 5 minutes, thinking about Conrad Voss's face when he'd said she was the best person to fix it, not the way a man says it to flatter a woman, and not the way a man says it to manipulate one. The way someone says it when they simply believe it to be true. She found to her own slight surprise that she believed him. The next 8 weeks were the most demanding of her professional life, and she had experienced some demanding professional periods. The Fulton market restructuring was worse than she'd initially assessed. The projection errors were compounded by 3 separate contractual ambiguities that would require renegotiation with lenders, a materials cost exposure that someone had deliberately buried in a subsidiary ledger, and a permitting complication that should have been identified 18 months ago by the people being paid to identify exactly that kind of thing. She worked 12-hour days. She worked through 2 weekends. She fought with Conrad's legal team about timeline and fought with the lenders about terms, and fought with the project's contractors about what was actually owed versus what had been assumed, and she won most of these arguments because she had done the work to win them. And when she occasionally lost, she recalibrated without drama and found a different approach. Conrad attended several working sessions. She had expected him to observe. He participated. This surprised her initially, and then stopped surprising her, because she recognized that it was simply his nature. He was not the kind of person who delegated understanding. He asked questions, some of which she answered easily, and some of which pushed her to think harder than she'd expected. And when she pushed back on his assumptions, he listened without the particular defensive adjustment she'd learned to watch for in powerful men who weren't used to being contradicted. He was quiet in a productive way. She was used to quiet rooms feeling like threat. His felt like thinking. They argued once, specifically and briefly, about the best approach to the lender renegotiation. She wanted a direct confrontation with the timeline. He preferred a more gradual disclosure strategy. She made her case with 3 numbers and a projection model she'd built the previous evening. He listened. He thought. He said she was right. Just like that. She went back to work. 2 months in, she was in the conference room at 11:30 at night, alone except for the scattered debris of a long session coffee cups, printed models, her own handwriting, across 3 whiteboards when the door opened and Conrad came in. She didn't look up immediately. "The Riverside group called," he said. "They're coming back to the table." She looked up then. "When?" "Next Friday." She let out a breath. The Riverside group had been the trickiest of the lenders, the one with the most aggressive terms, and the least patience for renegotiation. If they were coming back, it meant the restructuring was actually going to hold. "That's the hardest part done," she said. He looked at the whiteboards, at the 3 months of her handwriting. "You should be proud of this," he said. It was such a simple statement that she almost dismissed it. But there was something in how he said it, no qualifications, no context, just the fact of it that hit differently than the kind of praise she was used to receiving, which generally arrived in the form of being told she'd exceeded expectations, which always contained within it the original expectation. Conrad said it like someone recording a fact. She was the one who had done this. She looked at the whiteboards. "Yeah," she said, "I am." They stood there for a moment in the quiet conference room. 2 people who were both slightly surprised to find themselves here, at 11:30 at night, having built something that might actually survive. Then Conrad's phone rang and the moment passed. She packed up her notes. She went home. She laid in bed that night, thinking about what it meant to work beside someone who saw the work and not just the result. Not just what you produced, but what it cost, what it required, how it was done. She hadn't known she'd missed that. She fell asleep thinking about it, which was the first time in 4 months she'd fallen asleep thinking about anything other than the restructuring itself. She noted this. She was careful enough not to name it yet, but she noted it. The Riverside group came back to the table on a Friday morning in late March, and Mara was already seated when their lead negotiator walked in 12 minutes late without acknowledging it. She didn't say anything about the 12 minutes. She waited until he'd arranged his papers, and his assistant had poured water, and the small performative ritual of settling had completed itself, and then she opened her folder and said, "Page 4. The amended covenant structure. That's where we're starting." The negotiator, a man named Griffith, who had the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room, looked at her across the table with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of a man recalculating. She'd seen it before. She let him recalculate. The session ran 4 hours and 20 minutes. Mara didn't take a break. She drank 2 cups of coffee and ate half a sandwich someone left beside her elbow and never tracked who brought it. By the time Griffith closed his folder and said they'd need to review the amended terms with their board, his tone had shifted from the unhurried authority of someone holding leverage to the tighter register of someone who had just realized the leverage was less absolute than he'd assumed. After he left, the conference room was quiet. Conrad, who had sat at the far end of the table for the entire session and said almost nothing, looked at her. "You gave them the out on the penalty clause," he said. "Yes. I thought you said the penalty clause was non-negotiable." "It was non-negotiable until keeping it meant they walked." She capped her pen. "A penalty clause is only valuable if the loan actually restructures. If they walk, It's worth nothing. Conrad looked at her for a moment. You decided that during the session. 20 minutes in. He was quiet. Then he said, you should have told me. She looked at him. There wasn't time to have a sidebar without breaking the room's momentum. I made the call. His jaw shifted slightly. Not anger, she was learning to read the difference, but the adjustment of a man who had spent 30 years being the one who made calls in rooms like this. Next time, he said, tell me. If there's time, she said. Next time. He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary. Then something at the corner of his mouth shifted, barely, and he looked away. They went back to work. The restructuring closed in April. Not cleanly, nothing that size closed cleanly, but it closed with terms that protected the company's core assets, renegotiated the most dangerous exposure, and gave the project a genuine path to completion, rather than the controlled collapse that had been the likely alternative. Mara filed the final documentation on a Thursday afternoon and sat for a moment in her office, looking at nothing in particular. Her assistant knocked. Conrad Voss is holding on line 2. She picked up. It's done, she said. I know. A brief pause. I'd like to take you to dinner. She had been expecting this. Acknowledgement, gratitude, the professional gesture of a concluded engagement. That's not necessary, she said. I know it isn't, he said. I'm asking anyway. She thought about it for longer than she should have. All right, she said. The restaurant he chose was not the kind of restaurant powerful. Chicago men took business associates to not the visible trophy case establishments where being seen was half the point. It was a smaller place on the north side, Italian, the kind of room where the lighting was warm and the tables were slightly too close together and the noise level made private conversation possible. She noticed the choice. She didn't mention it. They talked about the restructuring first, then about her firm, then about a development project in Indianapolis that he mentioned without preamble, and then seemed to set aside. The conversation moved the way conversations move when two people are navigating around something. Neither of them has decided to name yet. She had one glass of wine. He had the same. At some point she couldn't have said when exactly the conversation shifted. It became less transactional. He asked her about her background, not in the way people ask at professional events, performing interest while waiting to speak, with the specific quality of someone who actually wanted to know. She told him about the MBA, about the 2 consulting jobs she'd worked simultaneously, about the particular kind of exhaustion that came with building credibility in rooms that started from a deficit position. He listened without offering the reassurances people offered when they didn't know what else to do. He said, You knew from the beginning that your name wasn't on anything. She looked at him. The Voss work, he said, 4 years of it. You knew your name wasn't on it. I knew, and you stayed. She thought about how to answer this. I thought we were building something together. The absence of formal credit seemed like a detail that would eventually be resolved. But it wasn't. No, Conrad was quiet. I watched my son make that decision, he said. The decision to keep your contribution informal. I didn't intervene because I thought he stopped. I thought it was what you'd agreed to. She looked at him carefully. You're telling me you noticed. I notice everything about my company, he said, including who's doing the work. The statement settled between them. She wasn't angry. She had moved far enough past the Voss years that what she felt was closer to recognition, the particular feeling of a thing finally being accurately named. Why are you telling me this? She said. He picked up his water glass and set it down. Because you deserve to hear it, he said. And because Dane should have said it and didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. This was the first time any member of the Voss family had acknowledged what the 4 years had actually been. She felt it move through her, not sentimentally, not with any dissolution of the composure she'd maintained throughout dinner, but as a real thing. The weight of being seen accurately by someone with no obligation to do it. Thank you, she said. It came out quieter than she'd intended. Conrad held her gaze. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then the waiter appeared with dessert menus neither of them had asked for, and the spell broke, and they looked at the menus and declined, and Mara began gathering her coat. In the car afterward, she sat in the back of the car she'd ordered and looked at the city, moving past the window, and thought about a man who'd noticed 200 things about his company's operations, and among those things had noticed her, specifically, and kept the information without using it until tonight. She didn't know what to do with that. She thought it was probably wise to do nothing with it, for now. She was correct. The photographs appeared 6 weeks later. A charity gala for a children's hospital foundation. The kind of event where half of Chicago's notable names appeared in the same room for the same 3 hours every spring. Mara attended because one of her clients was a member and had asked her to come. Conrad attended because Voss Meridian had been a long-term sponsor. They were set separately. They ended up in conversation for approximately 40 minutes near the back of the main reception room. The way you do at events like this, when you know someone well enough to have a real conversation, but the room is too full of people who want to have the performative kind. Someone photographed them. Someone sold it. The image appeared on a Chicago Society blog at 7:30 the following morning under a headline that implied significantly more than it depicted. Mara and Conrad leaving the gala, walking toward separate cars, in a moment that required heavy editorial framing to look like what the blog was suggesting it was. Mara saw it at 8:15, between her second coffee and her first call. She stared at it. Then she put her phone down and went to work. The calls started at 9. Former colleagues, mostly people who knew enough about her history with Dane to have questions about what they were seizing. Questions they dressed as concern because they had enough social intelligence to know that direct curiosity was rude. She managed the first 3 calls without mentioning the blog. By the 4th, she said, clearly and without excess explanation, that she'd attended the gala professionally and ran into Conrad Voss there, that they'd spoken briefly, that this was the entirety of the situation, and that she was confident the people calling her understood how these photographs worked. Most of them did. Some of them didn't. She stopped answering calls by noon. What she couldn't stop was the knowledge that these calls were also happening inside Voss Meridian. That people who worked for Conrad were seeing the photograph and draft and drawing the same conclusions. That Conrad's board was processing it, that Dane was going to see it. He called at 2:17 in the afternoon. She let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was controlled in the way messages left by people who are not actually in control of their emotions tend to be the words carefully chosen, the effort to sound casual, producing the opposite of its intended effect. Mara, it's Dane. I've seen the photograph. I think it would be beneficial for both of us to speak directly about this situation. Call me back. She listened to it twice. She did not call him back. She called Conrad instead. He picked up on the second ring. I assume you've seen it, she said. I've seen it. Your board is going to ask about it. Yes, and Dane has already called me. A brief silence. What did he say? I didn't take the call. He left a message. He wants to speak directly about the situation. She paused. His words, Conrad's exhale was barely audible. I'll handle Dane. That's not why I'm calling. She thought about how to say it. I need you to understand that I built my firm carefully. The perception of how I operate matters not for ego reasons, but because my clients are trusting me with significant decisions, and they're entitled to believe that my professional relationships are exactly what they appear to be. They are, Conrad said. I know that, she said. I need them to know it too. Another pause. Longer this time. What are you asking me? He said. She had asked herself that question for most of the day. I'm asking you to be straightforward with your board before they hear it from someone else's version. Tell them what our professional relationship is. Tell them what it isn't. Remove the ambiguity before it calcifies into something neither of us can correct. All right, he said, and I'm asking you to keep Dane away from me professionally. Whatever he needs to process about this, he can process with you. I won't be available as his sounding board. Understood. She waited to see if he would say anything else. He said, Mara. She waited. The board will be handled, he said. And the photograph is nothing I'm ashamed of. She thought about that sentence for a moment. Good night, Conrad, she said. She hung up. She sat at her desk in the quiet of a Thursday evening, the city doing its permanent work outside her windows, and she thought about a man saying, the photograph is nothing I'm ashamed of, which was not the same as saying, the photograph doesn't mean anything, which was a very specifically chosen sentence. She noticed that she'd noticed. She went home. Dane didn't handle it. That was the most accurate way to describe what followed. He didn't handle it the way someone handles a situation they've assessed clearly and responded to with proportionate force. He handled it the way someone handles a situation that has activated something irrational in them with escalating behavior that produced the opposite of its intended effect at each stage. He called Conrad. That conversation Mara heard about secondhand from Conrad, who reported it with the particular flatness of a man describing something that had exhausted him. Dane had accused Conrad of deliberately pursuing a relationship with Mara to punish him for the ballroom. He had accused Mara of engineering the professional consulting arrangement as a way back into the Voss orbit. He had suggested, without quite saying it, that Conrad was being manipulated by a woman who was considerably more calculated than he understood. Conrad had listened to all of this. Then he'd said, "Are you finished?" Dane had not been finished. He'd also said that the board would never accept Conrad's judgment if it appeared compromised by a personal entanglement. He'd said that the Mercer partnership, the one Dane had announced on the night that now seemed like a different geological era, had been specifically structured around Conrad, stepping back from day-to-day operations, and that Conrad's current behavior was destabilizing a deal that Dane had spent considerable time constructing. Conrad had said, "The Mercer partnership is your project. I have not interfered with it. Don't confuse my personal choices with corporate governance." Dane had said, "This is exactly what she does." Conrad had said, "What does she do?" Dane had said, "She makes you think you're in control." A very long silence. Then Conrad had said, "Good night, Dane," and ended the call. This was the version Mara heard. She believed it was accurate. What she heard from other sources, the network of professional contacts that functions in any concentrated industry as an informal intelligence apparatus, was that Dane was not keeping his agitation private. He'd been seen as a bar with two executives from Voss Meridian's development team, making comments about Conrad's judgment that were specific enough to be memorable. He'd called two board members directly unsolicited to express concerns about the optics of Conrad's relationship with a former personal connection. He had not used the word stepmother. He was clearly thinking it. Sloane, who had said nothing publicly since her departure from the ballroom story, appeared at a lunch with a mutual acquaintance that two separate people felt the need to report to Mara within 48 hours. Sloane had been collected, precise, and had said only that she wished Mara well, and that she hoped Mara understood what she was getting involved in. She had declined to elaborate. Mara heard all of this with the particular tiredness that comes from watching someone you once loved dismantle themselves. She told herself it wasn't her problem. This was almost entirely true. The problem that was actually hers arrived in the form of a phone call from one of her analysts on a Tuesday evening. She was at her desk running numbers on a new client engagement, and she answered the call because the hour was unusual. He worked late. They all did, but 9:40 on a Tuesday was late even by their standards. "I found something," he said. She set her pen down. "In the Fulton Market financials," he said. "The subsidiary ledger. The one with the materials cost exposure. I know the one. I went back in," he said, "because I was running the audit trail for the close documentation. And there are transfers I didn't flag initially because they looked like standard cost allocations." She was already pulling the relevant files on her screen. "But they're not," he said. She found them. She looked at the transfer records. She was quiet for a long moment. "When do these start?" she said. 14 months ago, before the project was in public trouble." "Yeah." She scrolled. The transfers were small individually, which was how they'd avoided attention initially. The kind of size that disappears inside a large project's cost structure if you're not specifically looking. But the pattern, the destination accounts, the timing, the relationship to specific project milestones told a story she was beginning to recognize. "Who has signing authority on these accounts?" she said. A pause. "The authorization chain runs through the project's executive committee," her analyst said carefully. "2 signatures required. And those signatures are?" "Dane Voss," he said, "and a CFO from the Mercer Capital side of the partnership. A man named Aldridge." She sat back. The room was quiet. 14 months ago, the Mercer partnership had been months from its public announcement. Dane had been still, ostensibly, in a relationship with her. He had been in the early stages of whatever he'd been constructing with Sloane's family. The strategic courtship she hadn't known was happening. The arrangement she'd only understood in full on the night it was revealed. And during that period, while the Fulton Market project was being mismanaged in ways she'd flagged and been told not to worry about, money had been moving. Not a catastrophic amount. Not enough to constitute an obvious fraud on its face. But enough, in the pattern she was looking at, to suggest that the project's financial difficulties had not been entirely accidental. "I need everything you have," she said. "Every transfer, every authorization signature, every date. Send it to me tonight." "Already sending," she hung up. She sat still for a moment. What she was looking at was the possibility, not a certainty. Not yet that the project she had spent 3 months of her life rescuing had been partially engineered to fail. That the financial exposure she'd identified and corrected had not been mere incompetence, but something with more deliberate architecture. That Dane and whoever Aldridge was had been using the project as a vehicle for something she didn't fully understand yet. What she understood clearly was this: if this was what it appeared to be, Conrad needed to know. And if she told Conrad, she was stepping into something that made the restructuring look simple. She opened the files. She started reading. She read for 4 hours. At 2 in the morning, she closed her laptop and looked at the window in the city and the dark water of the river below. She had the kind of clarity that arrives only at the far edge of exhaustion, when the mind stops negotiating with itself. The transfers were not accidental. Someone had been draining funds from a project that Mara had effectively been used to stabilize her credibility, her restructuring work, her reputation, and the draining had been happening before and during her involvement. Her work hadn't just saved the project. It had possibly been used as cover for continuing to extract from it, under the protective appearance of legitimate recovery. She had been used as scaffolding again. The word arrived with a specific physical quality, a tightening across her chest that she recognized as something between fury and the particular grief of a person discovering that their competence was weaponized rather than valued. She reached for her phone. She put it down. Not tonight. Not at 2 in the morning. Not before she'd run the full analysis and had documentation that was airtight. Because she was not walking into Conrad Voss's office with an accusation that implicated his son without the kind of evidence that could not be argued away. She went to the kitchen. She made coffee she didn't need. She stood at the window and drank it. 3 things were true simultaneously, and she held all 3 without letting any of them collapse the others. She had built her firm's credibility on clean work. She had committed to Conrad's company honestly and without agenda. And she had found something that she could not unfind and could not ethically ignore. Tomorrow she would finish the analysis, and then she would decide who else needed to know. Conrad arrived at her office the following afternoon without advance notice, which she didn't get to understand was simply how he operated. He showed up when he needed to say something, without the performance of scheduling. She was ready for him. She met him at the door rather than waiting at her desk, which was the only signal she gave that this was different from a routine visit. He looked at her face and said nothing, just waited. She told him to close the door. She told him what she'd found. She spoke carefully, without drama, because the material was dramatic enough without it, and because she had learned that the most powerful way to deliver difficult information to someone was without the emotional framing that allows the recipient to deflect toward the framing instead of the content. Conrad listened without interrupting. His expression did not change dramatically, but she watched his hand specifically. She watched his right hand, which was resting on the arm of the chair, and she watched the way his knuckles shifted as she described the transfer pattern and the authorization signatures and the timeline and what it suggested. When she finished, the room was quiet. He said, "How certain are you?" "About the transfers, entirely certain. About the intent, 65%. She paused. "But the pattern is consistent enough that the alternative explanations require increasingly complicated justifications." He was quiet. "There's a 48-hour window before the quarterly audit submissions go to the external review team," she said. "If this reaches that review without being disclosed internally, it becomes a different kind of problem." He looked at her. "You're telling me to act quickly," he said. "I'm telling you what the timeline is," she said. "The decision is yours." He stood up. He moved to the window. She watched his back. She thought about what it cost a man who had built something over 30 years to stand at a window, and processed the possibility that his son had been systematically extracting from it. Not the money. Conrad had enough money that the amounts involved were not what hurt. The implication, the architecture of it, the understanding that Dane had not merely made bad decisions in the boardroom, but had possibly been making deliberate ones. "I need the full documentation," he said without turning around. "You'll have it within the hour, and I need you to—" He stopped. She waited. He turned around. His face had not broken. It had done something more controlled, a settling, a compression, the look of a man who had decided to carry something rather than put it down. I need you to say nothing to anyone else until I've spoken to my counsel. Of course, she said. He held her gaze. Mara, she looked at him. I want you to know that whatever comes from this, he said, I know that you didn't have to bring it to me. She looked at him steadily. Yes, I did. He shook his head, barely. Not legally, he said. Not professionally. The restructuring is closed. Your obligation ended. I know, she said. I brought it to you anyway. Something moved across his face. It was not the gratitude of a transaction. It was something more personal than that, and less comfortable, and she recognized it because she had felt something similar in a restaurant on the north side, when he had said the photograph is nothing I'm ashamed of. He looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said, thank you, and picked up his coat and left. She stood in the middle of her office. She thought about Dane's face in the corridor behind the ballroom. The specific ease of a man who had calculated what she was worth to him and concluded that the answer was finite. She thought about the transfers, the timeline, the careful, patient extraction that had been happening while she was working 12-hour days, stabilizing the same project. She thought about Conrad at the window. Then she thought about Sloane Mercer's engagement ring, which she'd read was no longer visible in recent photographs. She thought about Aldridge. She thought about what a hostile board maneuver would look like when it was properly constructed. The pieces were not fully assembled, but they were beginning to form a shape. And the shape it was forming was not about a failed project or misallocated funds. It was about who was going to control Voss Meridian Holdings after Conrad. She sat down at her desk. She picked up her pen. She started writing. Because she understood now, with a clarity that settled low and cold in her chest, that the choice she had made in this office 4 months ago, when she'd agreed to consult on one project under strict conditions, and told herself it was purely professional, had made her part of something she could no longer step away from. She was in it. The only question was how much worse it was going to get before the people responsible for it understood that they had chosen the wrong person to use as their foundation. She finished the analysis at 4:17 in the morning. Not because she'd lost track of time, but because that was when the last piece locked into place, the final transfer in the sequence, the one that connected Aldridge's authorization signature to a holding company she'd had to trace through 3 layers of registration before she found the name underneath. She sat back in her chair. The name was Dane's, not directly. The holding company was registered in Delaware under a corporate name that meant nothing, Palladian Group LLC, but the registered agent connected to a law firm that connected to another entity, and that entity had a single member whose identity the Delaware registry recorded, without ceremony or editorial comment. Dane Gregory Voss. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she printed everything, put it in a folder, and went home to shower and change, before Conrad's counsel expected her at 8. The law firm Conrad occupied 3 floors of a building on Wacker Drive, the kind of firm where the carpet was dark, and the conference rooms had names instead of numbers, and nobody carried their own coffee. The lead attorney was a woman named Hartwell, who had the particular quality of someone who had heard every version of every bad situation and had stopped being surprised by human behavior approximately 20 years ago. Mara put the folder on the table. Hartwell read it without speaking. Conrad sat across from Mara. He had not slept either. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the particular tightness around his eyes that wasn't grief exactly, but something adjacent. The look of a man who has spent a night sitting with a hard thing and arrived at the decision to carry it forward rather than put it down. When Hartwell finished reading, she set the folder flat on the table and looked at Conrad. The transfers are documentable, she said. The authorization trail is clean. If this goes to the external review team in the current state, we're looking at a securities disclosure problem on top of the structural issues. Can it be contained? Conrad said. The disclosure issue. Yes, if we move in the next 36 hours and do this correctly. Hartwell's voice was even. The relationship issue. She paused, which was the closest she came to diplomatic softening. That is not something I can contain for you. Conrad was quiet. There's a complication, Mara said. Both of them looked at her. She opened the folder to the last section. The Delaware Registry, the holding company, the name at the bottom. Hartwell looked at it. Her expression did not change, But something in her posture shifted a slight forward movement, the body language of someone recalibrating. "This is new," she said. "I found it at 4 this morning," Mara said. Conrad reached across the table and turned the page toward himself. He looked at his son's name. The room was very quiet. Mara watched Conrad's face with the attention she gave to everything she needed to understand, not intrusively, not with any pleasure, but with the clear-eyed focus of someone who needed to know what she was dealing with. He was not going to cry. She already knew that. He was not going to perform the parental devastation that would make this scene more legible. What he did was something more controlled and more frightening than any of that. He looked at the name for approximately 12 seconds. Then he turned the page back. "All right," he said. Hartwell said, "I'll need to call the forensic accounting team today." "Do it," Conrad said. "And I'm going to recommend that we do not contact Dane until we have a complete picture. If he becomes aware of the investigation before it's documented." "He won't," Conrad said. His voice had no inflection in it whatsoever. "I'll handle my son." Hartwell looked at him for a moment, the look of someone who has seen many people say they will handle something and knows the difference between the ones who mean it and the ones who are protecting themselves from the meaning of what they're saying. She appeared to decide that Conrad meant it. "I'll make the calls," she said, and left the room. Mara and Conrad were alone. The city moved outside the windows. He said, "How long have you suspected it was intentional?" "Since I found the first transfers," she said. "But suspecting isn't knowing. And now you know. Now I have documentation." He nodded slowly. She looked at him directly, Conrad. He looked at her. "Whatever you're feeling about this right now," she said, "I need you to separate it from what happens next. Not permanently, but for the next 48 hours. He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm not going to fall apart," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not worried about falling apart. I'm worried about you walking out of here and calling your son before Hartwell has the forensic team in place." Something moved behind his eyes. "Because that's what a father wants to do," she said. "And I understand that. But right now you need to be the chairman." He held her gaze. 48 hours, she said. He breathed in slowly through his nose. "All right," he said. He picked up his coat. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. "You didn't have to stay until 4 in the morning," he said. She said nothing. "You could have handed it to me at 6:30 and let Hartwell do the rest." "Yes," she said. A pause. He said, "Why didn't you?" She thought about it honestly. "Because I needed to understand all of it before I could stand in a room and explain it without flinching," she said. "And because if I'd handed it over incomplete, whoever put it together might have missed the holding company." He was quiet for a moment. "That's one reason," he said. She didn't answer. He left. She sat in the empty conference room for a moment, the folder in front of her, his son's name on page 14. Then she picked up her phone and called her analyst. "Don't touch the files," she said. "Don't send anything. Don't copy anything. Don't discuss it with anyone in the building. Lock your workstation and go get breakfast. Is everything?" "It's handled," she said. "Just do what I said." She hung up. She looked at the city. She thought it was not handled. It was the beginning of something that was going to get considerably worse before it resolved. She had been in the middle of things before, difficult negotiations, hostile stakeholders, problems that required her to stay several moves ahead of everyone else in the room. But this was different in a way she was only beginning to measure. This was personal in a direction she hadn't chosen. She gathered the folder and left. The forensic accounting team found 4 additional holding entities by the following afternoon. Hartwell called Mara directly, which was the first time she'd done that. Previous communications had gone through Conrad's office. "The scope is larger than your initial analysis," Hartwell said. Her voice was the same careful even she'd used in the conference room. "We're looking at a coordinated structure, multiple vehicles." The Fulton Market project was one component. Mara sat very still. "How many projects?" she said. 3 confirmed, possibly 5. A pause. "The Riverside Group project that you restructured in March." She closed her eyes, just for a second. "Aldridge is a partner in 2 of the holding entities," Hartwell said. "The Mercer connection is deeper than we thought. This wasn't Dane acting alone. It was a coordinated plan," Mara said. "That's how the documentation reads, yes." She thought about the Riverside negotiation, the 48 minutes she'd spent on the penalty clause. The careful work she'd done to bring the lenders back to the table at terms that protected the company's core assets. The entire time, money was moving. Hartwell, she said carefully. The projects I restructured, the ones in this structure, my work on those projects. Does it appear in the documentation? A slight pause. Your restructuring reports are cited in several of the internal communications between Dane and Aldridge, Hartwell said, as stabilizing factors, as her word choice cover. The word landed precisely cover. She had been brought in by Conrad. In good faith, she believed that. She still believed that, but the result of her work, the credibility she had lent the projects, the public-facing stabilization she had achieved, had served as useful camouflage for what was being extracted underneath. She had been scaffolding again. Not for Dane this time. For his plan. I need to see those communications, she said. I'll have them to you within the hour. She hung up. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window and stood there. The anger was not the explosive kind. It was the slow, structural kind, the anger of someone who has been methodical and careful and done everything right and discovered that the playing field was crooked before they arrived. It was the kind of anger that doesn't make you want to break things. It makes you want to build something indestructible. She stood at the window until she felt it settle. Then she went back to her desk. She had work to do. Conrad called at 6. She answered on the first ring. You've spoken to Hartwell, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Then you know the full scope. I know what the documentation shows so far, she said. The forensic team may find more. He was quiet. She could hear his breathing slightly deeper than normal, the rhythm of someone managing something physical. I need to see you, he said. She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to see him, but because she was aware, with the particular clarity that came from exhaustion and sustained intensity, that the conversation they were about to have was going to cross a line she had been very careful about. My office is empty, she said. Come here. He arrived 40 minutes later. He had not changed from whatever he'd been wearing when Hartwell called him, which told her the afternoon had been long, and had not included anything ordinary. He looked like a man who had been carrying a very specific weight for a very specific number of hours and had decided to stop pretending it wasn't heavy. She had coffee on the table. He sat. He didn't touch the coffee. He said, he's been planning this for more than a year. Based on the timeline, yes. Before the Mercer announcement. Before the ballroom. He looked at her. Something passed between them that neither of them named the specific recognition of two people who have simultaneously arrived at an implication they hadn't been following consciously, but that was now unavoidable. He was already moving money when She stopped. When you were working for him, Conrad said quietly. She nodded, which means the decision to announce Sloane was not purely romantic, she said, or even primarily strategic in the way he presented it. The Mercer partnership was structural to whatever this is. Conrad put his elbows on the table and pressed his fingers together in front of his face, a gesture she'd seen him make in long meetings, when he was thinking rather than reacting. He needed the Mercer capital on the inside, he said. Aldridge is the vehicle, she said. Dane couldn't run a structure this size alone. He needed someone with access to an external capital source who was also willing to steal from my company, Conrad said. The word sat there. He hadn't flinched from it. She looked at him steadily. From your company, yes. He lowered his hands. She watched him decide something. I'm going to have to remove him, he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't something he was asking her to validate. It was a man saying out loud the thing he'd been moving toward since he first saw his son's name at the bottom of a Delaware registry. Before the quarterly review, she said. Before the quarterly review, he confirmed. That means the board meets in 6 days, I know. She thought about the shape of it, the board meeting, the documentation, the moment when Conrad Voss sat in front of the people who governed his company and laid out what his son had done. You'll need me at that meeting, she said. He looked at her. As what? He said. You're not an executive. You're not a board member. I'm an independent consultant whose work product is referenced throughout the evidence, she said. And I'm the person who found it. If the board is going to understand what they're looking at, they need me there to explain it. His expression was complicated. Not reluctant, she didn't read reluctance in him, but something more nuanced than that. The look of a man who understood that inviting her into that room would change things in ways that extended beyond the board meeting itself. All right, he said. She nodded. He reached for the coffee, finally, held it without drinking it. Mara, he said. She looked at him. Whatever it is you want to say, she said, say it. He set the coffee down. I owe you more than an apology can cover, he said. But I'm going to try anyway. She shook her head slowly. You didn't know. I didn't look hard enough, Conrad. No. His voice was firm, not angry controlled in the way it always was, but with more weight behind it. I brought you into this. I told you the project needed fixing, and I told you that Mara Ellison was the right person. And what I didn't tell you, he paused, was that I didn't look carefully enough at why it needed fixing in the first place. She was quiet. You did everything correctly, he said. You found something you weren't asked to find, and you brought it to me before it could damage you. And the result of that is that your name is in documents that are going to become part of a formal investigation. As a stabilizing factor, she said, as cover, I know. Your reputation. My reputation is based on the work I actually did, she said, which is documented, independently. Before any of this, she looked at him directly. I'm not afraid of what an investigation finds when they look at what I built. He held her gaze. She said, Are you? He shook his head. Once, definitively. No, he said. Something settled between them that she didn't have a precise name for. Not comfort, the situation was too raw for comfort. Not trust, exactly, because trust was already established, and this was something beyond it. Something that happened between people who had been in hard situations together and had both looked clearly at the worst possibility and decided to stay anyway. She thought about the word carefully. She thought solidarity. She thought, don't name it any further than that right now. Go home, she said. Sleep if you can. The next 6 days are going to require everything. He stood. He picked up his coat. At the door he stopped, as he always did. She was noticing as if he conducted one final check before leaving a room. He looked at her. You're the steadiest person I've encountered in 30 years of building things, he said. I want you to know I recognize that. She didn't look away. I'll see you in 6 days, she said. He left. She sat in the empty office for a long time. The leak happened on day 4. She didn't know how. Hartwell's team was small and carefully selected. Conrad's circle was as tight as she'd ever seen it. But on the 4th morning, she opened her phone to 3 messages from different journalists and a call from a board member she didn't know personally, all time-stamped before 7 in the morning. The story that had leaked was not accurate. That was almost worse than accuracy would have been an accurate story could be responded to directly. What had leaked was a version, partial and specifically distorted, that framed the situation as Conrad Voss launching an investigation into his son at the behest of a personal interest. The phrase used in one of the messages was under the influence of a romantic entanglement. She read it twice. She understood immediately what it meant and who it served. She called Conrad, he answered. His voice told her he had already seen it. Who knew enough to frame it this way? She said. A silence that was 1 beat too long. Conrad, Dane has a contact on the board, he said. I suspected. Which one? Another pause. Weyrich, he said. She thought of Senator Weyrich at the charity gala. His easy conversation, the way he'd been drifting closer to Dane's orbit over the past several months. She'd noticed it peripherally and filed it under politics rather than conspiracy, which was the kind of mistake you made when you were focused on the work in front of you instead of the room around you. He didn't leak the investigation itself, she said. He leaked the framing. Yes, which means Dane knows we're moving. Yes. She stood up from her desk. How long before the board meeting? 41 hours, she thought quickly. Dane is going to make a move before the meeting, she said. He's not going to wait for Conrad to sit in that room and present documentation. He's going to try to discredit the source, you, Conrad said. Me, she said, the romantic entanglement framing. He needs the board to see this investigation as personal Conrad acting under my influence, me acting from revenge motivation. If he can establish that framework before the meeting, any evidence we present gets filtered through it. What do you need? Conrad said. Tell me everything Weyrich knows. He knows the investigation exists and that you're central to it. Does he know about the holding companies? I don't believe so. Then Dane doesn't know we found Palladium, she said. He knows we're coming, but he doesn't know how much we have. She moved to her desk and opened her laptop. I need to get to the 2 undecided board members before Weyrich does, she said. Not to present evidence that's for the meeting. just to establish direct contact. So they've heard my voice before they hear Dane's version. I'll send you their personal numbers. And I need Hartwell to prepare a one-page summary, clean, clinical, no editorial, of the documentation chain. Something I can describe verbally without revealing specifics. Enough that if someone asks me directly, I can demonstrate I know exactly what I'm talking about. She can have that within 2 hours. Good, she started typing. Mara, he said. She stopped. He's going to come at you personally, Conrad said. Whatever he does in the next 41 hours, some part of it will be personal. She thought about Dane in the corridor behind the ballroom. His cufflinks, his prepared speech. The man who had looked at 4 years of her life and summarized them as scaffolding. I know, she said. Are you prepared for that? She thought about the question seriously. She thought about the woman who had walked through a ballroom in an ivory gown with rain coming down outside. The woman who had sat in her kitchen at 2 in the morning running calculations, because that was what she knew how to do when the world stopped making sense. She thought about everything she had built since that night. Yes, she said. She hung up. She kept working. Dane called at 9:40 that night. She had been half expecting it and half hoping he wouldn't, because she knew the conversation was going to cost something and she had a limited reserve. She answered. Silence for a moment. Then you know you're destroying our family. His voice was different than she remembered from the corridor. Tighter, younger sounding, somehow in the way voices become young when the performance inside them starts slipping. I'm not destroying anything, she said. You found something you didn't understand, and you ran straight to him with it. I understood it completely, she said, a pause. Mara, his tone shifted. Something softer, more practiced the register he used when he was trying to manage her. Whatever you think you found, there's a context you don't have. There are structural reasons those transfers exist that. Dane, her voice was level. Don't, I'm asking you to. I know what Palladian is, she said. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. She could hear him breathing. I know what Aldridge is, she said. I know the timeline. I know which projects, I know which accounts, and I know when it started. She paused. I know it started before the ballroom. His breathing changed. So whatever story you're building for the board, whatever framing you gave Wayrich, I need you to understand that the documentation I have is complete and it is airtight, and there is no version of this that survives the meeting. Another long silence. Then, very quietly, he said, You were supposed to be gone. She heard it, and for a moment she felt it, the specific hurt of being told directly what someone had intended for you. Not the plan he'd made for the company or for his father. The plan he'd made for her. That she would leave and not look back, and not find anything, and not matter anymore. She said, I moved on. You were supposed to be... Move on, she said. And I did, Dane. I moved on completely. The only reason I'm in this conversation is that you used my work as cover for something criminal, and then had the specific arrogance to assume I'd never find it. It's not criminal? Her voice sharpened. Hartwell has a different word for it. So does the forensic accounting team, and so will the board. Silence. She waited. When he spoke again, the performance was entirely gone. What remained was something raw, something she'd almost never heard from him in 4 years. It sounded like actual fear. He's going to cut me out, Dane said. She said nothing. My father is going to sit in that boardroom and cut me out because of you. Because of what you did, she said. Mara. Something broke slightly in his voice. Whatever you think of me, whatever you have every right to think he's still my father. You know what it would do to him, too. Don't, she said. Her voice did not rise. Do not use him to get to me. I'm not using, yes, she said. You are, and it is the most Dane thing you have ever done, and I am not available for it. He was quiet. She held the phone and waited, and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been careful and precise and correct for days running, and is now being asked to absorb someone else's consequence. The meeting is in 38 hours, she said. If you have evidence that contradicts what I've documented, bring it. If you have an explanation for the holding company, bring that too. She paused. But I will be in that room, Dane, and everything I found will be on that table. And it is going to be what it is, regardless of what you call me between now and then. He said nothing. She said good night. She hung up. She put the phone face down on the desk. She sat still for a moment with both hands flat on the surface. She thought 38 hours. She thought, you cannot fall apart before the meeting. She thought about Conrad's face in the conference room, his son's name at the bottom of page 14, and the 12 seconds he had looked at it before he said all right and meant it. She thought about being scaffolding. She thought about the company she had built, the floors she was occupying, the name on her door. She picked up her phone. She called Hartwell. "I need the complete documentation packet on my desk by 6 in the morning," she said. "Every holding entity, every transfer, every authorization signature, the full communication chain between Dane and Aldridge." "It'll be there," Hartwell said. "And I need a second copy in a separate location," she said. "Not digital." A brief pause. "You think someone's going to try to move it," Hartwell said. "I think in the next 38 hours someone is going to try to do something," Mara said. "I want to be prepared for every version of that." "Understood," Hartwell said. Mara hung up. She looked at the window. Chicago moved below her, indifferent and continuous, the way it always did. She thought about what the board meeting was going to cost. Not professionally, she had run that calculation, and she was prepared for it. But personally, the cost of standing in a room and presenting evidence against a man's son while the man sat at the head of the table and watched. The cost of being the person who does the right thing, when the right thing is also the hardest thing. She thought about the word Conrad had used, steadiest. She thought, "I need to be that for 38 more hours." She thought, "And then we'll see what's left." She turned back to the desk, opened the folder, and kept working into the night with the specific, grinding discipline of someone who has no exit left and has chosen to meet what's coming head-on rather than run from it. She got 4 hours of sleep, not because she allowed herself more, but because her body took it without permission somewhere. Around 3 in the morning, her head dropping toward her folded arms at the desk, and when she woke at 7, the documentation packet from Hartwell was already under her office door in a sealed envelope, with a second copy in a padded mailer addressed to a secure location she'd specified. She stood up. Her neck ached from the angle she'd slept at. Her eyes felt like something had been dragged across them. She went to the bathroom, ran cold water over her face and held it there for 10 seconds, and looked at herself in the mirror with the particular assessment of someone taking inventory rather than seeking reassurance. She looked tired. She looked ready. She backed to the desk and opened the packet. The board convened at 10 in the morning in the main conference room on the 34th floor of the Voss Meridian Tower. 14 directors, Hartwell, and 2 members of her team positioned along the wall. A forensic accountant named Price, who had spent 20 years doing exactly this kind of work and had the affect of someone who had stopped being affected by it approximately 18 years ago. Mara arrived at 9:40. She wore the same dark blazer she'd worn to her first meeting with Conrad's legal team, not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately, but because it was the one she reached for when she needed to feel like herself rather than a version of herself constructed for an audience. She set her copy of the documentation packet at the seat Hartwell had reserved for her. She looked at the room. The table was long enough that she couldn't read everyone's expression from a single vantage point. She identified the ones she'd spoken to in the previous 38 hours brief, direct calls in which she'd said almost nothing substantive, but had established enough of a direct relationship that her presence in the room would not be entirely surprising. She identified Weyrich at the far end, who looked at her with the studied neutrality of someone who had committed to a position and was waiting to see how it played. She sat down. She organized her pages. She breathed. Conrad entered at 9:52 with Hartwell beside him, said nothing to the room, and took his seat at the head of the table. He looked at Mara once briefly directly, and she gave him a single small nod. He turned to address the room. At 9:58, the door opened. Dane walked in. She had not known he would be there. Hartwell had not known either. The expression on Hartwell's face in the 2 seconds before she composed it told Mara that clearly. Dane was not on the agenda. He had no formal role in this meeting. His presence was an insertion, which meant he had either convinced Weyrich to get him access or had simply decided to appear and was banking on the specific social difficulty of removing someone physically from a room. He was wearing a suit she'd never seen before, which meant he'd bought it recently, which meant he'd planned this. His face was controlled in a way that cost him something. She could see the effort of it in the flatness around his eyes, the jaw that was being held rather than resting. He walked to an empty chair 3 seats from Conrad. Nobody stopped him. He sat down and looked directly at Mara. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. First, the moment stretched for 2-3 seconds, and then Conrad said, "This meeting is called to order," and the room shifted its attention, and Mara shifted hers. Conrad did not acknowledge Dane's presence. He began. He spoke for 7 minutes without notes, which was one of the things about Conrad that she had learned to recognize as significant. He prepared everything, and then spoke without the paper in front of him, because he wanted the room to see his face rather than the top of his head. He described the forensic accounting review. He described the documentation. He described the scope. He did not editorialize. He did not say, "My son did this." He said the evidence indicates the following authorization chain. He said the following transfers are documented. He said the following holding structure has been identified. He used the names as data points rather than accusations, which was the more devastating approach, because it left the room no emotional scaffolding to attach to, no paternal anguish to redirect toward, no visible conflict to debate. Just facts sequenced cleanly, without a single pause. When he finished, he said, "Price will walk through the forensic findings." Price stood up. Dane said, "Before we proceed." The room went still. Conrad looked at him. His expression did not change. "I have a right to respond to allegations made against me," Dane said. His voice was controlled. Almost. The almost was visible if you knew where to look. "This is not an allegations meeting," Conrad said. "This is a board meeting." "Then I'd like to know why an external consultant is seated at this table," Dane said, and looked at Mara. 14 heads turned. She kept her expression neutral. "Ms. Ellison is present in her capacity as the consultant who identified the documentation and whose work product is referenced throughout the evidence," Conrad said. "She's here to answer technical questions from board members." "She's here because you trust her," Dane said. "I trust the documentation," Conrad said. Price began. 20 minutes in, Dane interrupted for the second time. He'd been still for 20 minutes. Mara had tracked him in her peripheral vision, while appearing to follow Price's presentation, the way she tracked difficult people in difficult rooms, and the stillness had cost him. When he spoke, his voice was slightly rougher than it had been. "The Palladian structure was disclosed to council during the partnership formation," he said. Price stopped. The room was silent. Mara did not look at Dane. She looked at Price because Price had the documentation, and Price's face was the one that mattered. "The disclosure records don't reflect that," Price said. "Then the records are incomplete," Dane said. "We reviewed the complete record," Price said. "Flat, no effect, like a man identifying a number. There is no disclosure documentation." "That's incorrect." Price looked at him. "I'm happy to receive any documentation you have," Price said. "If counsel has a record, we can review it. My counsels will produce it," Dane said. Conrad said, "When?" A pause. "I'll need to contact them this afternoon." "This meeting is now," Conrad said. Dane looked at him. Something passed between father and son across the length of that table, something Mara couldn't entirely read, because it was built from 30 years of history she hadn't been part of. But she read enough. She read that Dane had come into this room with a strategy, and the strategy had a gap in it, and he had just exposed the gap. He had claimed the disclosure existed. He hadn't brought it, which meant either it didn't exist or he hadn't been certain the claim would be tested this directly and hadn't prepared for the alternative. She thought, "He's improvising." She thought, "That's a mistake." Weyrich spoke from the far end of the table. "I think we owe a full hearing to all parties," Weyrich said. "Given the seriousness of these allegations, perhaps a brief recess." "We're not recessing," Conrad said. Weyrich's eyebrows shifted. "Conrad, if there's documentation that contradicts the forensic findings, it can be produced and reviewed," Conrad said. "Requesting a recess on the basis of documentation that doesn't currently exist is not something I'm willing to accommodate." Weyrich said, "The board should have input on process." "Then let's take a vote," Conrad said. "All in favor of a recess?" Weyrich raised his hand. One other director, she identified him as a recent Mercer-adjacent appointment, raised his. 12 did not. Weyrich lowered his hand. Conrad says, "Price." Price continued. The next 40 minutes were the most controlled chaos she had witnessed in a professional setting. Dane asked questions that were technically procedural but functionally designed to introduce doubt not doubt about specific facts, which were too well documented to attack directly, but doubt about process, about Mara's role, about whether the investigation had been conducted with appropriate independence given the personal relationships involved. He was good at it. That was the part she hadn't fully accounted for. She'd watched Dane in enough rooms to know he was capable of performance under pressure, but she'd never watched him fight for something he genuinely could not afford to lose. And whatever else was true about this situation, Dane could not afford to lose this boardroom. He worked the room's uncertainties with precision. He targeted the 3 directors he'd calculated were persuadable not with facts, because he didn't have better facts, but with tone, with the specific implication of impropriety, with the word romantic delivered twice in different contexts, as if it were a synonym for compromised. She watched 2 directors begin to shift, not dramatically. Just the slight physical adjustment that means someone's internal calculation has moved. Conrad was watching it too. She could tell by the particular stillness he went into the compression she'd identified before, the containment of a man managing something visceral while keeping his face professional. Then Dane looked at her directly and said, "I'd like to ask Miss Ellison a question." She looked at him. "Through the chair," Conrad said. Dane looked at Conrad. "Through the chair," he said, with controlled contempt. "I'd like to ask Miss Ellison's when she first became aware that her personal relationship with the chairman would benefit from an investigation into his son's business activities." The room pressure changed. She felt it the way you feel a temperature drop not in one place but everywhere at once. She kept her hands flat on the table. She looked at Conrad. Conrad said, "The question mischaracterizes Miss Ellison's role and the timeline of the investigation. It will not be answered in that form." "I'm asking a board question," Dane said. "About a conflict of interest. You're asking a loaded question designed to reframe documented fraud as a personal grievance," Conrad said. His voice had not raised. It had, if anything, lowered the specific register of a man who has stopped manage himself and started simply being himself, which in Conrad's case was more frightening than anger would have been. "And I won't permit it." "You don't get to decide what the board permits," Dane said. "I chair this meeting," Conrad said. "You have a conflict of interest in chairing this meeting," Dane said. "I'm formally requesting that the board vote on whether—" Dane. Conrad said his son's name and the room went completely quiet. Not the managed quiet of procedural silence. The actual quiet of people who have suddenly understood that what they're watching is not theater. Father and son looked at each other across the length of the table. "You built something in this company's structure that extracted money from 3 projects over 14 months, Conrad said. "I have documentation. I have authorization signatures. I have the holding entities. I have the communications between you and Aldridge." He paused. "I have Palladian." Dane's face did something she'd never seen it do. "And the only question before this board," Conrad continued, "is whether to refer this to the appropriate authorities or to pursue internal remediation first. That is what we're deciding today, nothing else," Weyrich said. "Conrad." "Gerald." Conrad looked at Weyrich with something that was not quite warmth and not quite threat but contained elements of both. "Whatever Dane told you about this situation when he asked for your support, I want you to consider the documentation in front of you and decide which version of events it supports." Weyrich was quiet. "I've known you for 19 years, Conrad said. I'm not asking you to side against Dane because he's my son. I'm asking you to look at what's in front of you." A long silence. Weyrich looked down at the packet in front of him. He hadn't opened it during Price's presentation. He opened it now. Dane pushed back from the table. It was a physical thing, sudden, scraping, the noise of it cutting across the room's tension. He stood up. His face had given up the performance entirely, which left something rawer than she'd expected to see in public. He looked younger, cornered. "You're going to do this," he said to Conrad. Not a question. Conrad looked at him. "In front of all of them," Dane said. "You're going to sit there and—" "Sit down, Dane." No, his voice cracked slightly. He didn't appear to notice. "You brought her in here. You brought her into this room, into this company, into—" He stopped. He looked at Mara. She met his eyes. She kept her face still. She thought, "Don't." She thought, "Don't make this personal in front of 14 people because you will not recover from it." But she could see that he was past the point where rational calculation was available to him. He had walked into this room with a strategy, and the strategy had collapsed, and what was left was Dane without the performance. which was a person she'd glimpsed occasionally, over 4 years, and always found more complicated than the version he showed publicly. "You think you won something," he said to her. She didn't answer. "You think coming here, finding this, sitting at his table?" "Dane," Conrad said. "She thinks this is Dane, sharper." He stopped. He looked at his father. And something in that look the specific way Dane looked at Conrad in the silence that followed made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't expected and didn't entirely want. Because underneath the anger and the cornered panic, underneath the performance collapsing and the strategy failing, there was something that was simply a son looking at his father and realizing something irreversible had happened. She had to look away. She looked at the table. Conrad said, "Sit down." Dane didn't sit, but he stopped talking. A director named Caulfield, she'd spoken to him 2 days ago, quiet, methodical, the kind of person who waited until he had complete information before forming a position, said, "I'd like to move to a vote on the referral question." Conrad said, "Seconded?" 4 hands went up simultaneously. The vote took 3 minutes. 11 in favor of immediate referral to outside counsel and parallel notification to the relevant regulatory bodies. 2 abstentions. Weyrich voted in favor. Dane said nothing. He looked at the vote tally on Hartwell's notepad across the room, and she watched him read it, and she watched some in him go very still. Conrad said, "This meeting is adjourned." He looked at Hartwell. "Stay." He looked at Mara, "Please stay." Then he looked at Dane. "You and I will speak privately." Dane's jaw was tight. "Now," Conrad said. The board filed out over the next 4 minutes, which was the longest 4 minutes she'd experienced in recent memory. Directors packed their folders, spoke in murmurs, avoided eye contact with Dane, and the room rearranged itself until it was Conrad, Dane, Hartwell, Mara, and the particular acoustics of a suddenly empty space. Dane was standing at the window, his back to the room. Conrad stood up from his chair. He didn't approach Dane. He stopped midway between the table and the window and said, "The referral goes to outside counsel this afternoon. You'll need to retain your own attorney before that call is made." Dane said nothing. "I'm telling you this now," Conrad said, "so you have time." Dane turned around. His eyes were red at the edges. He hadn't cried, and she didn't think he would. It wasn't the kind of red that came before tears. It was the kind that came from pressure, held too long in a small space. "You did this," Dane said. Conrad said, "You did this." Dane stopped, swallowed. "I built an alternative. Because you have been running this company like your personal monument for 20 years, and nobody in that room was ever going to matter as much as your next project, your next deal, your next stopped again. Your next surrogate," he said. The word landed. Conrad didn't answer immediately. Mara sat completely still. She understood that the word wasn't only about her. It was about everything that had come before her. Every person Conrad had prioritized over his son. Every room Dane had tried to enter and been told to wait. Every version of the story in which the company was the protagonist and Dane was a supporting character in his own inheritance. She understood it. She didn't think it justified what he'd done, but she understood it. Conrad said, "You wanted the company without earning it." You took from it," Conrad said. "There's a difference." Silence. Dane looked at Mara. "Tell me it was worth it," he said. She looked at him. "Tell me being in that room, finding that, sitting next to him through all of it. Tell me it was worth what it cost you." She said, "This isn't about me, Dane. Everything is about you now," he said. "That's been true for a year." She shook her head slowly. "You made decisions that damaged your father's company," she said. "Those decisions existed before I found them. They would have surfaced without me. The only thing I changed is when." He stared at her. "Call your attorney," she said. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at his father. And then Dane Voss, who had walked into this room 47 minutes ago, with a strategy and a suit he'd bought specifically for this occasion, and the particular confidence of a man who believes he has anticipated everything, picked up the jacket he'd draped over the chair and walked out of the conference room without another word. The door closed. The room was quiet. Hartwell said, "I'll initiate the referral call." "Give me 10 minutes, Conrad said. Hartwell nodded and stepped out. Conrad and Mara were alone. He walked to the window where Dane had been standing. He looked out at the city. She waited. He said he wasn't wrong about everything. She said nothing. "The company," he said. "The way I ran it. What I prioritized." He was quiet. He wasn't wrong. "No," she said. But that's not what this is, Conrad said. No, she said again, it's not. He turned around. He looked at her across the empty conference room with the city behind him and the afternoon light cutting through the floor-to-floor sailing glass and the particular exhaustion of a man who has just done one of the hardest things he will ever do and knows the harder parts haven't begun. She looked back at him. There was something she'd been careful not to name for several months. Standing in an empty conference room, 34 floors above Chicago, 30 minutes after watching a man present evidence against his own son, because it was the right thing to do, she found she was slightly less careful about it than she'd been before. She thought, not now, not in this room, not today. She stood up. She gathered her pages. She crossed the room and stood beside him at the window and looked at the city with him for a moment, not touching, not performing any version of comfort that would be smaller than what the moment required, just standing beside him in the quiet while the city did what the city always did. Then she said, "You did what needed to be done." He looked at her. "So did you," he said. She picked up her folder. "I'm going to give you the 10 minutes you asked for," she said. "And then you're going to call Hartwell and make the referral." He nodded. She walked to the door. "Mara," he said. She stopped. She waited. He said, "I need to ask you something." She turned around. He was still at the window. His hands were in his pockets, the posture of a man who has decided to be direct and is organizing himself toward it. "However this resolves," he said. "Whatever comes next for the company, for the investigation, for all of it." He looked at her. "I don't want you to disappear again." She held his gaze. She thought about the ballroom, the rain, the kitchen at 2 a.m, the office on the river, the folder on a conference room table, every room she'd walked into in the past year that had required something from her. She hadn't known she had until she found it standing in front of a problem too significant to walk away from. She thought about what it meant to be seen accurately, without agenda, by someone with no obligation to do it. She said, "I'm not going anywhere." It was not a promise about geography, or a company, or a professional arrangement. He heard it correctly. Something in his face settled, not released, not dissolved, just settled, the way tension settles when something it was braced against turns out not to require bracing. "Good," he said. She left him to his 10 minutes. She walked down the corridor toward the elevator, past the offices of a company she had restructured and documented and fought for, without ever having a title inside it, and she pressed the button and waited and thought about the meeting and Dane's face and the 11 hands that had gone up and the vote tally and the door closing. She thought about what came next, not with dread, not with the specific anticipatory exhaustion of someone bracing for more damage, with the quiet, clear-eyed attention of someone who has been through the worst part and knows it because they've been through worse and survived that too, and who understands that the work on the other side of this moment is going to require exactly the same thing that got her here. Not invincibility, not perfection, but the willingness to stay in the room and keep going when every easier option says leave. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. The doors closed on the 34th floor of Voss Meridian Holdings, and she rode down through the building she had helped save twice without ever being asked to save it once. And when the lobby doors opened onto the Chicago afternoon, she walked out into the cold air with her folder under her arm and her name on a building 6 blocks away and a meeting she needed to get to and a company she was still building. She kept walking. The referral went to outside counsel at 4:17 that same afternoon. Mara knew the exact time because Hartwell sent her a confirmation message, brief, factual, the kind of message Hartwell specialized in, and she read it sitting at her desk in the Ellison Strategic Group offices, while her 2 senior analysts worked quietly in the adjacent room, neither of them asking questions she hadn't yet answered. She typed back a single word, "Thank you." Then she set the phone down and sat for a long moment with her hands in her lap. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in late autumn, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself dramatically, but simply arrives and settles, persistent and indifferent, until you stop expecting anything warmer. The river below her windows was the color of pewter. People moved on the bridge with their shoulders up and their faces down. She thought about Dane walking out of that conference room, the jacket over his arm, the door closing. She thought about how much smaller a man looks when the performance leaves him. Then she stood up, picked up her pen, and went back to work. The investigation took 11 weeks. Outside counsel moved carefully and thoroughly, which was what thorough investigations did. They took time that felt unreasonable to everyone inside them. The forensic accounting team expanded its scope twice. 3 additional transactions surfaced in the second week that hadn't appeared in Mara's initial analysis. Smaller and more carefully obscured, which Price described in a written summary as consistent with the established pattern, which was the forensic accountant's version of saying, yes, he did more of it. Aldridge retained separate counsel within 48 hours of the referral and began cooperating within the week, which told Mara everything she needed to know about the structural relationship between Aldridge and Dane. Aldridge was an instrument, sophisticated and culpable, but ultimately an instrument, and instruments cooperate when cooperation offers better terms. Dane did not cooperate initially. His attorney issued statements. There were procedural challenges to the documentation chain, to the independence of the investigation, to the role of an external consultant whose professional relationship with the chairman constituted a conflict. The challenges were competent, and they were unsuccessful, and they cost time. Mara tracked it the way she tracked everything precisely, without becoming invested in the timeline. Because she had learned a long time ago that you couldn't control how long hard things took, and the energy spent willing them to resolve faster was energy that didn't go anywhere useful. She ran her company. She took 2 new clients in October, a mid-size hospitality group and a logistics firm that had been badly mismanaged through a rapid expansion and needed someone to come in and tell them the truth about their numbers before the truth arrived uninvited. She hired a 3rd analyst, a woman named Perry, who had spent 6 years at a firm that hadn't known what to do with her, which Mara recognized immediately because she had been that person. She moved Ellison's strategic group into a larger space on the same floor at the end of October. 4 floors had been the plan, and 4 floors was what she took, which required a conversation with her landlord that she handled herself without an intermediary, because she had learned that some conversations produced better outcomes when you were physically present. The sign on the door said Ellison's Strategic Group in clean block letters. She stood in front of it on the first morning and looked at it for approximately 10 seconds. Then she went inside and started the day. She and Conrad had dinner twice during the 11 weeks. Not at the charity gala circuit, not at the visible restaurants where being seen was part of the point. Small places. The kind of evenings where the conversation started professionally and became something else by the second hour. The gradual shift of 2 people who had been through something significant together and were now navigating what existed on the other side of it. He asked about her company. She asked about the investigation. Both of them avoided the subject of Dane in the same instinctive way you avoid a bruise, not from weakness but from the knowledge that pressing it doesn't produce useful information. He told her once, over coffee near the end of the first dinner, that he'd visited Dane. She waited. He wasn't what I expected, Conrad said. Which was angrier. He turned the cup in his hands. He was quieter than I've seen him, since he was a boy. She said nothing. He asked about you, Conrad said. She looked at him. Not in a hostile way, he paused. He asked if you were all right. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about Dane at 35, in whatever room he was in, having arrived at a question about whether the person his plan had used as cover was doing okay. She didn't know exactly what to do with it. It didn't resolve anything. It didn't undo the 14 months of transfers, or the coordination with Aldridge, or the specific coldness of using her restructuring work as camouflage. But it was something. What did you tell him? She said. I told him you were building something considerable, Conrad said. She looked at him. Was that all right? He said. Yes, she said. She picked up her coffee. That's all right, she said. The investigation resolved in the second week of December. Outside counsel submitted findings to the board. The regulatory notification that had been made in November resulted in a civil inquiry that ran parallel to the internal process. Aldridge reached a settlement that involved disgorgement of his share of the extracted funds, a significant financial penalty, and a permanent bar from serving in certain financial capacities. Dane's situation was more complicated because Dane was Conrad's son, and because his attorney was, whatever else she thought of the process, genuinely capable, and because the structure of the arrangement had been built with enough distance between the authorization signatures and the direct benefit that establishing intent at the legal standard required more than documentation of the pattern. What resolved it in the end was the cooperation agreement. Dane signed it. She heard about it from Hartwell, another brief factual message, another single-line confirmation, and she sat with the information for a moment before calling Conrad. He answered on the second ring. "I heard," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you all right?" A pause longer than his pauses usually were. He started, she waited. "Not yet," he said. She understood that. "Then we don't have to talk about it tonight," she said. He was quiet. "Mara," he said, "will you come over?" She looked at the window, the city, the cold. "Yes," she said. She went. His apartment was on the 42nd floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, which she had been to twice before in professional contexts. Once to review documents he'd wanted to discuss outside the office. Once for a dinner that was also, technically, professional, and had resolved into something less easy to categorize. It was the kind of apartment that reflected someone who had spent 30 years acquiring the resources to live exactly as they wanted, and had chosen to live with severe restraint, clean lines, minimal furniture, a few specific things on the walls that you could tell mattered rather than being placed for effect. He opened the door before she knocked. He had changed out of the suit he'd been wearing at some point during the day. He was wearing a sweater she'd never seen before, which made him look like a different version of himself, less contained, or contained in a different way. She came in. He didn't say anything immediately. He went to the kitchen and came back with 2 mugs of something that turned out to be tea rather than the coffee she'd expected, which was its own kind of information about the evening. They sat. The city existed beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows at a remove that felt appropriate present but not intrusive, the way background sound functions when you need to have a conversation that requires space around it. She let him start, he said. When Dane was 8 years old, he designed a building. She looked at him. He had graph paper, Conrad said. He'd stolen it from my office, which I didn't know at the time. And he spent a Saturday building this architectural drawing of a structure he called the Voss Tower. He looked at the window. It was terrible. The proportions were completely wrong. He'd drawn the lobby bigger than the rest of the building combined. She said nothing. He brought it to me on a Sunday morning and laid it on my desk while I was working. He paused. I told him the proportions were wrong. The silence stretched. I didn't look at what he'd actually done, Conrad said. 8 years old, spending a Saturday trying to build something, bringing it to show me, and I told him the proportions were wrong. She held the mug in both hands. Conrad, she said. He looked at her. You did what needed to be done, she said. Last month, in that boardroom. Today, with the agreement. You did what needed to be done, and it cost you something real, and that's what it is. She paused. But I'm not going to sit here and let you carry the whole weight of who he became. You are, she said. I can see you doing it. He was quiet. He made choices, she said. Specific, deliberate choices over 14 months, with full knowledge of what they were. The graph paper story is real, and the cost of it is real, and I'm not dismissing it. She set her mug down. But he's 35 years old, Conrad. The proportions story was 27 years ago. He looked at her for a long time. Then something in his face shifted, not a collapse. Nothing that dramatic, but a slight release. The loosening of something that had been held too tightly for too many weeks. You're very difficult to argue with, he said. I know, she said. He almost smiled. She picked up her mug. They sat in the quiet of the apartment with the city below them and the winter pressing against the glass, and she thought about what it meant to be in a room with someone who didn't need her to be invulnerable, who didn't need the performance of competence she maintained for every other room she walked into, who had seen her at 4 a.m. and at conference tables, and in parking structures, and in corridors behind ballrooms, and had accumulated all of it into a complete picture and chosen to be here anyway. She thought, this is what you build toward. Not the company. Not the floors or the sign on the door, or the clients who called, because they'd heard her name from people who mattered. This, the room where you don't have to perform. She didn't say any of this. She didn't need to. He said, I'd like to ask you something. She looked at him. I'd like to ask you properly this time, he said. Without an investigation pending, and a board meeting scheduled, and everything else that's made the last several months what they've been. She waited. He looked at her with the directness that was simply how he looked at things, not strategically, not performing confidence. Just a man who had decided to say a thing and was saying it. I'd like to know if you'd consider marrying me, he said. The apartment was very quiet. She looked at him. She thought about the ballroom, the ivory gown, the way 200 people had rearranged their attention and left her standing at the center of it alone. She thought about the kitchen at 2 a.m. and the business plan on the table and the office on the river and Perry and the 4 floors and the sign. She thought about Conrad at a window with his son's name on a piece of paper and the 12 seconds he'd looked at it before saying all right and meaning it. She thought about being scaffolding. She thought about what it meant to be invited in instead. Yes, she said. He looked at her. He said, "That's everything," she said. They married in February on a day that was cold enough that the lake was partially frozen at the edges, the ice extending 20 feet from the shore before giving way to dark open water. The estate they'd chosen was private, a property north of the city, owned by a friend of Conrad's who had offered it without being asked, which was the kind of offer that only people with genuine warmth made. 40 people, no press, no tabloid circus, no performance. Mara wore a gown that was not ivory. She'd decided that deliberately, not from superstition, but from the simple clarity of not wanting to wear the color she'd worn the last time she'd dressed for an evening that was supposed to change her life. This gown was deep ivory, with the faintest warmth to it, almost cream, the kind of color that photographs as white, but in person has depth. She carried no flowers. She didn't want to carry anything. She walked to Conrad across a room full of people who knew them both independently, and had watched the year unfold from various distances, and when she reached him, he looked at her the way he always looked at things, directly, completely, without performing the emotion for anyone watching. She preferred that to any alternative. The ceremony was short. The officiant said the necessary things, and they said the necessary words, and when Conrad placed the ring on her finger, he held her hand for a moment after, not dramatically, not for the room, just a second of stillness between two people who understood what they were choosing. She said, "I do." He said, "I do," and that was that. Dane did not attend. He sent a note. It arrived 2 days before the wedding, handwritten on plain paper, no letterhead, the handwriting of someone who had started the letter 3 times, based on the pressure variations in the ink. It said, "I'm not going to pretend I understand it. I'm not going to pretend I'm happy about it. But I know what you did in that boardroom wasn't about hurting me. I've been working on understanding the difference between those two things for a while now. I'm not there yet, but I'm working on it." That was all. No signature. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her desk drawer and didn't take it out again. Conrad stepped down as CEO in March. The announcement went to the board first, then to the company, then to the financial press, which covered it with the particular intensity reserved for transitions inside privately held empires where the succession question had never been publicly resolved. Speculation ran immediately to Mara, the new wife, the consultant who had exposed the Dane situation, the woman who had restructured 2 projects and whose company was visibly thriving. The speculation was wrong. Conrad appointed Eleanor Marsh, a 53-year-old operating executive who had run 3 companies in the built environment sector and had the specific combination of operational discipline and strategic patience that the company needed in a post-investigation environment. She was not family. She was not affiliated with Mara. She was simply the best qualified person for the position, which was precisely what Conrad said when he announced it. The board approved unanimously. Mara heard about the approval in a text from Hartwell, another brief factual message, which was entirely appropriate, and she sat in her office on the 5th floor of a building that now had her name on the lease in 4 places, and thought about what it meant that she wasn't the one walking into the Voss Meridian CEO office. It meant exactly what she'd always said it meant. She had built her own. She didn't need theirs. 6 months after the wedding, on a Tuesday in August, Mara took her first full day off in 14 months. Not a weekend day, not a working from home day, an actual day, no calls, no email, no client obligations, that she spent doing nothing that could be described as productive. She walked along the lakefront in the morning. She ate lunch at a restaurant she'd been intending to try for 2 years. She sat in a coffee shop in the afternoon and read a novel she'd been carrying in her bag for 4 months without opening. She thought about the investigation. She thought about the year. She thought about the woman who had walked through a ballroom in an ivory gown, believing her life had collapsed. She thought about what that woman had not known then, which was not that it would be all right, eventually, in some vague aspirational sense, but that the collapse itself was the thing, That the moment the building fell was the moment you found out what was actually load-bearing and what had only been decorative, and that everything you built afterward was built from the real materials. She drank her coffee. She read her book. She went home to the apartment. She and Conrad shared his apartment originally, reorganized now in ways that reflected two people rather than one. The particular evidence of a shared life, accumulating in small details on surfaces, and she made dinner, which she did rarely, and without particular skill, but with enough basic competence to produce something edible. Conrad came home at 7. He looked at the table and then at her. "You cooked," he said. "Don't make it significant," she said. He sat down, they ate. It wasn't a remarkable dinner. The sauce was slightly underseasoned and the timing on the vegetables was off by 5 minutes. They talked about a project of his that was running into a permitting complication, and a client of hers who had called 3 times that day, despite being told she was unavailable. Neither subject was resolved at the table. It was exactly what an ordinary evening looked like. She had spent a long time not having ordinary evenings. She had not known until recently how much weight they could carry. Dane called on a Thursday in September. Not to Conrad, to her. She saw his name on her phone and sat with it for a moment, 2 rings, 3 before answering, because she wanted to be in the right place internally before the conversation, not braced against it, but not unguarded either. "Hey," he said. His voice was different. She noticed this in the note, and she noticed it now something quieter, less performed. The register of someone who had spent several months with fewer people to perform for. "Hey," she said, a pause. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I'm in Milwaukee," he said. "I took over the subsidiary." "The one Dad," he stopped. "The one Conrad offered." She hadn't known this specifically. She'd heard something general about Dane stepping back from Chicago, but not the details. "Okay," she said. "It's a disaster," he said. "The books are a mess, the staff is half what it needs to be, and the market here is," he exhaled through his nose, "it's not Chicago." She said nothing. "I'm not complaining," he said. "I just wanted another pause. I wanted you to know I'm doing it. Actually doing it. Not just saying I'm going to." She looked out her window at the lake. "I know," she said. "You don't know," he said. "You haven't seen it." "No," she said. "But I believe you." Silence. "Why?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "'Cause you called tell me, instead of waiting for someone else to report it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a low bar," he said. "It's a start," she said. Another silence. Then he started. "He's well," she said. "Is he?" Dane stopped again. Tried differently. "Is he happy?" She thought about Conrad at the dinner table. The apartment reorganized. The particular quality of a man who has carried hard things and set some of them down. "Yes," she said. Dane made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite not one. "Good," he said. And it cost him something to say it. She could hear the cost, but he said it anyway, which was more than she'd expected from him a year ago. "Dane," she said. "Yeah, call him," she said. Silence. "I don't know if he wants." "Call him," she said. "He won't tell you to call." "He'll wait until you do. That's who he is." She paused. "But he wants you to." A longer silence. "All right," Dane said. She heard him breathe. "Thank you," he said, for he stopped. "You don't have to finish that sentence," she said. "I want to," he said. "For the note. For not another stop more frustrated. For not making it harder than it had to be. In the room." That day. She looked at the lake. The day in the conference room. Dane standing at the window. The things she could have said and didn't. The things she'd looked away from, because some moments require you to look away. "We're all right, Dane," she said. She meant it. She heard him hear it. "Okay," he said. "Take care of the company," she said. "I'm trying," he said. They hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand. She thought about what it took to make a call like that. The specific effort of choosing directness over avoidance, when avoidance was available and familiar, and required nothing. She thought about a man in Milwaukee with a damaged subsidiary and a mess of books, and no Chicago reputation to lean on, making the effort anyway. She didn't forgive him in that moment precisely. Forgiveness wasn't something she could schedule or announce. It was something that had been happening quietly for several months, in increments she hadn't tracked, and she understood it as a process rather than an event, not a decision she made once, but a direction she'd been moving, and would continue moving at its own pace without being rushed. What she felt in that moment was something more immediate than forgiveness. It was recognition. The recognition of someone who had been through enough to understand that people were not fixed. That the person who used you and the person who called from Milwaukee to report that they were actually doing the work were the same person in different phases, and that phases could change, and that this was not the same as excusing what came before. She set the phone down. She went back to work. On a Friday evening in November, almost exactly 2 years after the night in the ballroom, Mara stood at the window of her office at the end of a long week and looked at the city. Ellison's strategic group had 16 employees now. She was running 3 simultaneous client engagements and had turned down 2 others because she'd learned slowly, imperfectly, with several mistakes along the way, that the work was better when she was not overextended. That the quality of thinking required to do what she did was not infinitely scalable by adding hours, and that the version of herself who worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week, was not as effective as the version who protected 8 hours of sleep and 1 full day off and dinner at the table with. Someone who made dinner feel worth coming home for. She was still learning this. She would probably be learning it for years. Perry knocked on the open door. "I'm heading out," she said. "Have a good weekend," Mara said. Perry paused in the doorway. "Can I say something?" Perry said. Mara looked at her. Perry was 31 and had the specific quality of someone who had spent 6 years being underestimated and had recently discovered what happened when that stopped a kind of expanded confidence that was still learning its own edges. Mara recognized it. "Go ahead," she said. "I sent the Walcott analysis this afternoon," Perry said. "The final version. I saw it," Mara said. "I wanted to say—" Perry stopped, recalibrated. "I wanted to say that working here has been I've learned more in 8 months here than in 3 years at my previous." She stopped again. "I just wanted you to know that." Mara looked at her. "Keep doing the work the way you've been doing it," she said. "That's all that needs to happen." Perry nodded. "Good night," she said. She left. Mara turned back to the window. She thought about a version of herself who had spent 4 years doing the work and watching it get credited elsewhere. The particular grinding specific cost of that, not the absence of title or money, but the absence of being seen doing it. The way competence without attribution can, over time, make you doubt what you're actually worth if separated from the structure that's been using it. She had separated from the structure. She had found out. She looked at the sign on the door of her office, visible through the glass panel, her name, her company. She had found out. Conrad was picking her up at 7. They had dinner reservations at a place she had chosen, which she always appreciated, because Conrad's instinct was to defer and her instinct was to decide, and this was one of the small, continuous negotiations of a shared life with another person who had strong preferences. She picked up her coat. She turned off the desk lamp. At the door she paused the same pause Conrad always made, which she'd noticed she was doing too now, the final inventory before leaving a room. She looked at the office, the work on the desk, the files stacked in the organized system that made sense to her and nobody else. The framed photo on the shelf, not a glamorous one, just a photograph Perry had taken at the company's first anniversary gathering. Candid Mara laughing at something, her head slightly tilted, her face not performing anything. It was the only photograph in the office. She kept it because it looked like someone who had stopped bracing for the next thing. She turned off the light. She closed the door. She walked through the lobby of a building with her name on the lease in 4 places and pushed through the glass screens into the November cold, where the city was doing its permanent thing, moving, breathing, indifferent to any single story happening inside it. Conrad's car was at the curb. He stepped out when he saw her, which he always did not because she needed a door opened, but because he was someone who stood up when a person he wanted to see arrived, and she had decided a long time ago that this was something she was going to keep appreciating, rather than dismissing as unnecessary. He looked at her. "Long day," he said. "Good day," she said. He held the door. She got in. He walked around to the other side and settled in beside her, and the car pulled away from the curb into the Friday evening traffic, and the city moved past the windows in the particular way. Cities move when you're inside them, and no longer need them to be anything other than what they are. She looked at the lake when it came into view, dark and enormous and thoroughly unimpressed by the story of the past 2 years, by the ballroom and the corridor and the kitchen at 2 in the morning, and the business plan and the board meeting and the vote tally and the phone call from Milwaukee. The lake had been there before all of it and would be there after, and did not organize human events into narratives of victory or loss. She found this unexpectedly comforting. Conrad said, "Perry sent me the Walcott analysis." She looked at him. "She carbon copied you," she said. "She thought I might find it relevant to the meridian restructuring," he said. Mara almost laughed. "I'll talk to her," she said. "Don't," he said. "She was right. It is relevant." He paused. "She's good, I know," Mara said. She looked back at the window. "She reminded me of you," he said, "when I first came to your office." She thought about that. "She's better organized than I was," she said. "That's a very low bar," he said. She did laugh then. It came out easy, which it did now with a regularity she hadn't anticipated 18 months ago, not the performed ease of someone managing an impression, but the actual ease of someone who had found the room where performance wasn't required and had been spending time in it. She settled back. The car moved through the city. 2 years ago, on a night very much like this one in terms of temperature and the quality of the dark over the lake, she had walked through a ballroom full of people who watched her face for her reaction to a thing that had rearranged everything she'd planned. She had not known then what she was walking toward. She had known she was walking. That had been enough. The restaurant came into view. Conrad's hand found hers on the seat between them, briefly, without ceremonies, the way you reach for something you've reached for many times. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. Outside, Chicago moved and burned and continued, as it always had, as it always would. And Mara Ellison, who had once walked through a crowd, believing her life had ended, because one man had looked at everything she was and decided it wasn't enough, rode through the city she had rebuilt herself inside, and felt, with the particular quiet certainty of someone who has been through the fire and come out, changed rather than destroyed, that she was exactly where she had worked to be. Not because of who stood beside her, because of who she had become standing there, fade out.